The moment you react emotionally to someone's words, actions, or behavior, you've handed them remote control over your inner state. Most people live their entire lives as prisoners of their own reactions, believing that others make them angry, hurt, or frustrated. But Carl Jung discovered that true mastery over your reactions isn't about controlling external circumstances. It's about understanding the internal psychological mechanisms that create reactivity in the first place. Jung developed specific techniques for achieving what he called psychological objectivity, the ability to observe your own reactions without being controlled by them. This creates what he termed inner peace, not the absence of challenges, but the presence of unshakable psychological center that remains stable regardless of external chaos. True mastery over your reactions becomes possible when you understand that every emotional trigger contains valuable information about your own psychological development needs. Developing the observer. Jung emphasized the crucial importance of developing what he called the observing function, a part of consciousness that can witness your own psychological processes without being completely identified with them. This observer creates the psychological space necessary for choice rather than automatic reaction. Jung wrote about the need to develop sufficient psychological distance to allow conscious reflection rather than unconscious possession by emotions. This observing capacity doesn't eliminate emotions, but creates sufficient distance to choose appropriate responses rather than reacting automatically. The observer function develops through what Jung called self-observation, regularly noticing your emotional states, thought patterns, and reactive tendencies as if you were a scientist studying psychological phenomena. This practice gradually strengthens your capacity to remain conscious during emotional activation. Jung distinguished between being possessed by emotions and having emotions. Possession means losing conscious control and reacting automatically from emotional patterns. Having emotions means experiencing them while maintaining enough awareness to choose how to respond. Developing the observer requires recognizing what Jung called the difference between the ego and the self. The ego represents your conscious personality and immediate emotional reactions. The self represents a deeper center of consciousness that can observe and integrate all psychological material, including difficult emotions. Jung noted that the observer function grows stronger through regular practice of what he called active imagination, deliberately engaging with your own psychological processes through meditation, journaling, or symbolic dialogue. This practice creates familiarity with your own inner landscape and builds capacity to navigate emotional storms without losing psychological balance. The goal isn't to become emotionally numb or detached, but to develop what Jung called conscious relationship to the unconscious. Awareness of your psychological patterns that allows choice rather than compulsion in how you respond to challenging circumstances. Practice noticing the gap between external events and your internal reactions. In that space between stimulus and response, the observer function operates and conscious choice becomes possible. The Transcendent Function. Jung discovered that mastery over reactions involves activating what he called the Transcendent Function, the psyche's ability to bridge conscious and unconscious material to create new possibilities that neither could produce alone. This function operates most powerfully during moments of psychological tension and conflict. Jung explained that this psychological capacity emerges when conscious attitudes and unconscious reactions are held in creative tension rather than immediately resolved through action. Instead of automatically reacting or suppressing emotions, you learn to hold both perspectives simultaneously. The transcendent function manifests as the ability to experience anger while also understanding its psychological source, to feel hurt while recognizing the projection involved, or to notice fear while maintaining awareness of your deeper psychological stability. This creates what Jung called a third position that transcends the original conflict. Jung observed that the transcendent function requires what he termed suffering the tension of opposites, allowing contradictory feelings or perspectives to coexist without immediately resolving them into action. This builds psychological capacity to handle complexity and reduces the compulsion to react immediately when triggered. The function operates through symbolic thinking, approaching emotional reactions as meaningful communications from the unconscious rather than just disturbances to be eliminated. Each reaction contains information about psychological patterns, unresolved conflicts, or developmental needs that require conscious attention. Jung noted that the transcendent function produces genuine changes in how you perceive and respond to challenging situations. This transformation occurs naturally when conscious and unconscious material are allowed to interact creatively rather than being forced into premature resolution. The practice involves deliberately pausing when triggered and asking, "What is this reaction trying to teach me about myself? What psychological material is being activated? How can I respond from my deeper center rather than my immediate emotional reaction?" This approach transforms triggers from annoyances into opportunities for psychological growth and self-knowledge. Shadow integration. Jung understood that most emotional reactivity stems from what he called shadow projection, unconsciously attributing your own disowned psychological material to others. The qualities that trigger your strongest reactions often represent aspects of yourself that you cannot acknowledge or accept. Jung wrote extensively about how the shadow contains not just negative qualities, but also positive potentials that have been rejected due to family conditioning, cultural expectations, or personal history. When others display these disowned qualities, they activate internal conflict between recognition and denial. Shadow integration involves what Jung called withdrawing projections, recognizing that intense emotional reactions reveal more about your internal psychological landscape than about external triggers. The person who seems arrogant might be reflecting your own unlived confidence. The individual who appears weak could be mirroring your own unacknowledged vulnerability. Jung observed that shadow work requires considerable moral effort, the courage to acknowledge your own capacity for the qualities you judge in others. This doesn't mean acting out negative behaviors, but rather accepting their existence within your psychological makeup. The integration process involves what Jung called making the shadow conscious, deliberately examining your strongest judgments and reactions to discover what disowned aspects of yourself they represent. This work transforms enemies into teachers and irritations into opportunities for psychological completion. Jung noted that successful shadow integration dramatically reduces emotional reactivity because you no longer need to defend against recognizing unwanted qualities in yourself. When you accept your own potential for selfishness, others' selfishness loses its power to trigger defensive reactions. The practice involves honestly examining your strongest negative reactions to others and asking, how might this quality exist within my own personality? What would it look like if I expressed this quality in healthy rather than destructive ways? This transforms judgment into understanding and reactivity into compassion. Unshakable peace. Jung's concept of inner peace differed radically from popular notions of calm or tranquility. For Jung, genuine peace emerged from what he called psychological wholeness, the integration of all aspects of personality into conscious awareness and choice. This wholeness includes what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the ability to contain contradictory feelings, perspectives, and impulses without being torn apart by them. Peace comes not from eliminating conflict, but from developing sufficient psychological capacity to contain and integrate all aspects of human experience. Jung observed that people who achieve this integration develop what he called unshakable presence, a quality of being that remains stable regardless of external circumstances. This stability doesn't come from suppressing reactions, but from understanding their psychological source and meaning. The peace Jung described involves what he called reconciliation with the unconscious, accepting rather than fighting the psychological forces that create emotional reactions. This acceptance doesn't mean passive resignation, but rather conscious cooperation with deeper psychological processes. Jung noted that genuine inner peace often includes the willingness to feel difficult emotions fully while maintaining awareness of your deeper psychological center. This creates resilience that can withstand any external storm. The path to unshakable peace involves what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming psychologically whole and self-determined. This means taking responsibility for your own reactions rather than expecting others to manage your emotional state. Jung emphasized that this peace serves not just personal well-being, but also relationship harmony. When you stop reacting unconsciously to others' behavior, you can respond from wisdom rather than woundedness, creating space for genuine connection and understanding. True mastery over your reactions emerges when you realize that every trigger is actually an invitation to reclaim disowned aspects of yourself and develop greater psychological wholeness. In this way, difficult people become unconscious teachers, and challenging situations become opportunities for growth. The peace you seek isn't found by controlling your environment, but by developing such psychological completeness that external circumstances can inform but never control your internal state.